Believe it or not, most towns in America are small towns. You might see New York represented in movies and TV, California discussed in newspapers and tabloids constantly. But sometimes foreigners fail to realize that America is absolutely massive, and a fair bulk of us live in small, unheard-of towns, just trying to get by, until some hairy mountain monster comes down and devours us. Hey, it's not the best life, but it's what we've been given. Enjoy these 5 allegedly true scary stories from small towns. If you have a story of your own, be sure to share it with us at darkstories.org. Now, let's begin. School Lockdown from Anonymous. I was 12 years old and in the 7th grade. I should probably mention here that the middle school is across the street from the elementary school. The population of our town was slightly above 1,000, so it was enough to have a school district. It was the day before winter break, and it was snowing lightly outside. I was in my 8th period class, which was algebra. My teacher let us have free time, as we did all of our exams for the semester already. Besides, it was the last period before winter break started, and everyone was antsy. My classmates and I were having a good time doing whatever we wanted, until the principal's voice came over the loudspeaker. "This is a red lockdown alert. Red lockdown." My teacher and my classmates were freaking out, because red lockdown means that an intruder has gained access to the school and is actively armed. My teacher shushed us into the corner and locked the door, telling us to be quiet. The teacher ended up breaking down and crying as soon as she did this. We knew then that this was no drill. She ended up telling us that the elementary school across the street is having a lockdown too. Some kids were already injured. Apparently, the assailant had gone there first. We would later learn that 20 other children and teachers would be injured here in our own school. I remember shivering, terrified. I didn't think something like this could happen to us. I prayed that the intruder would not find us. I prayed that myself or someone that I cared about did not get hurt. It was one of the first times I remember realizing that life is fragile and that the people around me could be taken away from me at any moment. And then I heard it, a deep voice telling us to open the door as someone began to bang on it, rattling the doorknob. I could tell he was trying his hardest to break down that door with his body weight, but luckily it was sturdy. I should probably mention here that the windows on every classroom door are bulletproof. That's the standard now. After a dozen failed attempts to break in, he tried to open up the door by firing at the window. But all that did was ricochet the bullet from the window. We heard the guy curse from his frustration. He was grunting in anger and began to march down the hall to the next classroom. He didn't have a target. He was just trying to get into any door he could. After a few minutes, a SWAT team came and opened the door, escorting us out of the building. They tracked down the man in the school, which was easy enough because his footprints were covered in snow from outside. It was chilling to the bone outside, but thankfully, they quickly found the man and escorted him away. He gave every kid he saw a stare of anger and malice. I knew that at that moment the weather wasn't the thing causing me to shiver. My parents ended up picking me up. They were crying hysterically. I could tell that this was something they had feared before. I can't imagine being a parent, hearing about all these school lockdown incidents all over the country, and wondering if, or when, it could happen to your own child. Our small town was devastated by the attack. A website was created for donations of the 20 victims of the attack. Everyone came out okay. No lives were actually taken that day, and everyone came back from their injuries. But there's a memory in my head that I've created, one birthed by paranoia and fear. A false memory of the horrors that could have happened if the man had gotten inside. Home Alone Horror Story from Anonymous. I was 9 years old when this happened. I lived in a small town in Ohio. The house we lived in at the time was about 40 years old, had those creepy, creaky stairs. It was rusting and rotting all over. The incident happened around 11:20 one night. I was of course home alone at the time. Out of nowhere, I heard a big bang sound, like someone was smashing their entire body weight or an object against the door. Immediately after, I heard footsteps circling around the back door before someone's hand tried the doorknob. But because the house was rotting, the doorknob gave way, and the door literally fell from its hinges without much force, hitting the wood floor with a loud boom. I held my breath out of fear and pure terror. My 9-year-old self imagined what the intruder was going to do to me. Was he going to hurt me? Take me away from my family? I could even picture the incident on the news tomorrow. A headline like, "Young boy taken, presumed dead." Maybe I was being overdramatic, but again, I was only 9 at the time. Soon after, I began to hear drawers, cabinets, and doors being thrown open, stuff being moved around, some of it being taken. That's when I quickly remembered that my bedroom door did not have a lock on it, and I did not have any weapons to defend myself. Plus, I was too young for a cell phone, so the only phone was downstairs. All I could do was hope and pray that the intruder did not find me. I began to hear some heavy footsteps making their way upstairs. The intruder then placed their hand on my doorknob. The door began to creak open. A silhouette began to form in my doorway. A moment before I could make out who it was, what they looked like, I began to hear screaming outside, multiple voices, as well as sirens. I cowered in the corner. I heard heavy, frantic footsteps running back downstairs and outside. Adults continued to shout until I heard my name amongst the shouting. I was carried outside by a police officer. There I saw the neighborhood and my family waiting for me. It was only by chance that when this man broke into the house, a neighbor saw him and immediately called the police. Just think about that. If that neighbor hadn't been looking towards my house at the right time, I could be dead. That was definitely my creepiest experience. Hadleigh Jack from Howard. There's a couple of stories I'd like to share about the small town I grew up in, which have really been playing on my mind recently. To give you some background, I still live in the town. I'm actually a solicitor and a town councilor, so I can't mention it to any of my associates, but everyone who lives in my town knows there's something going on. Call me Howard. The town in question is Hadleigh in England. Hadleigh is an ancient settlement with a long and distinguished history, but also some dark, dark days. Many tourists visit the quaint medieval shops or Gothic church. You can also take a walk up the Gallows Hill, where the old town gallows used to stand. It's the principal location for this tale. In the early 1700s, the town hangman was a strange individual named Jack Partridge. He was strange-looking with gangly limbs and beady eyes. He had been the butt of many jokes when he grew up, but was much feared once he took up the job as hangman. It was said that he'd always wanted the job. practicing knots, and eventually persuaded the previous hangman to take him on as an apprentice. When the previous hangman killed himself on his very own gallows, Jack was elevated to position of hangman himself at the tender age of 16, making him the youngest hangman in all of England. In light of what you're about to hear, you may be wondering whether the old hangman's passing was his own demise, or whether someone had a hand in it. Well, everything was fine in that sleepy town for some years, and from time to time when a local criminal was found guilty for a heinous crime, it was always remarked upon how proficiently Jack Partridge undertook his services. Many people even visited to watch his proceedings. However, after a time it became notable that increasing significant crimes were occurring in the area, and each time the person or persons responsible vehemently denied their crimes. But there was always some piece of persuasive evidence which resulted in guilty charges. Whatever the town council did, irrespective of how many hangings were ordered, crime seemed to be on the rise. A couple of years after this dangerous trend started, another alarming trend emerged. Every Halloween, there would be a killing. The first was in 1720 when a young woman named Mary Clark returned to her cottage one night and was disturbed to find a stick figure hanging from the porch above her front door. In the morning, she was found dead, hanging from the rafters. In the following years, the pattern emerged. A strange stick figure would always be the prelude to a death every Halloween. Even when people realized the significance of the figure and often took refuge in neighbors' houses, they would nonetheless be found dead by morning. Finally, after much slaughter, chance intervened. A local girl named Matilda Groom was found hanged. One of her neighbors, Sarah Rand, claimed she had seen Jack Partridge leaving the property early in the morning. The magistrate and his men quickly attended Gibbet Cottage, where Jack lived on the edge of town. There they found him. An inspection of the house discovered a cache of stick figures. This was proof enough, and Jack was taken from the house, marched straight to the town gallows. There he was, tied to the gallows, and a fire was built around him. To the shrieks and delight of the town, he was killed. In his death throes, he cursed the town and its residents, claiming that he would return and take his vengeance. It was reckoned later that Jack had developed a lust for killing. Once his regular flow of prisoners stopped being enough, he contrived to get townsfolk convicted of crimes so that he had more to hang. But his bloodlust increased, and he began his own reign of killing terror. For a while, after these events, Hadleigh became famous, and people began to visit the town, the location of the notorious story. Jack Partridge became forever immortalized in the children's rhyme and game Hadleigh Jack. In this popular English playground game, one child represents Jack and has his back turned, while the other children have to creep up on him, chanting, "Welcome back, Hadleigh Jack." At some point, the child playing Jack spins around screaming Jack's back and begins to chase the others. Well, now to my experience. I was in my teens working a pizza delivery job. We got a lot of prank calls back then, and as you'd figure, Halloween was a particularly bad time for this. So when I was asked to take a delivery of a 12-inch Tex-Mex stuffed crust to Gibbet Cottage, I thought it was likely a hoax. Gibbet Cottage was a wrecked cottage at the end of a deserted lane, and was believed to be the original hangman's cottage for our town. No one had lived there for decades, but my boss insisted it was a genuine call, and after all, perhaps someone was finally doing it up. When I arrived, I was surprised to see the cottage looked recently renovated, and there was even smoke rising from the chimney. Though I was slightly disturbed to see a stick figure hanging from the door knocker. But I quickly reminded myself it was Halloween after all. The chap who answered the door was very tall and ungainly looking. He had piercing eyes which seemed to follow you around the room and freaked me out. I happened to mention that I didn't know that anyone lived in the cottage. He said that he was simply visiting and had a job to do that night in town. This all sounded strange, and I wasn't going to hang around long, so I handed him the pizza, and he thrust a quantity of coins in my hand. Like I said, I was in a hurry to get away, so I simply thanked him. Didn't even bother to count and check the money. When I got back, my boss was furious. All the coins turned out to be extremely old and not even proper currency. The following day, when I told a friend about it all, he said that we should go check out the house, so we drove back in daylight. I was amazed to see the cottage all tumbled down like before, with no roof and no sign of life at all. The following shift at Pizza Hut, I handed in my notice. Besides looking for bigger and better things, delivery was just too much of a creepy, unpredictable mess. But I have a second experience. A couple of years ago, I was walking home on a Halloween. I'd been to a town council meeting, which had gotten quite rowdy, and the beer had been flowing. I was pretty desperate to use the bathroom at one point, so I went into a wooded area and did my business. Once I'd done my business, I retraced my steps out of the wood, coming face to face with a stick figure dangling at about head height. I freaked out. I didn't remember it being there. I've traveled this part of the woods before. I immediately thought of the stories of Hadleigh Jack, and I was scared. That whole night I expected something to happen to me. I was afraid that I wouldn't see daylight. Fortunately, I'm here to tell my story still. Considering I was alive in the morning, I was actually beginning to think the legend was just toothless. Until I went into my office the following day, when I discovered that the photocopier was not working, despite it being new. I laughed and thought, if anything, Hadleigh Jack was finding new ways to take out his revenge. I have one more story. One day I was mucking around online. I came across a family tree website and decided to research my family. Anyone out there who's done the same thing usually winds up discovering their family's pretty dull. That's how mine started too, until I began to notice some pretty scary coincidences. The first thing I noticed that I was related to Sarah Rand. You may recall she was the person who implicated Jack Partridge. The next thing I noticed was that Sarah Rand died the following year. The date of her death was the 31st of October of 1736. In fact, I began to see that an alarming number of my family died on October 31st. Now, I don't believe in legends, but every time I wake up on November 1st these days, I think to myself, well, I've made it through another year. Mothman in Ohio, from Zachariyha. Even though it's the summer of 2019, I think the Mothman is still here. I used to live in Florida, but moved in with my father, who lives in a small town along the Ohio River. When I moved in, I was mostly homesick from my old place, under the weather, so I stayed inside and watched through the windows at all the new animals that I'd get to see here. Now where we live, the neighbors keep to themselves and don't really socialize. One day, I sat down watching the birds and rodents outside. Now, there is a large widowmaker in the yard, and it had been calm all day. As I was eating, I looked out the window and noticed all the animals were gone. Then some branches began to fall in the yard. I blamed it on the harsh wind, but when I looked around, none of the other trees or bushes were swaying at all. Puzzled, I went back to eating and went to watch TV. Later that night, I filled up my water bottle, and as I did so, I looked out the window above the sink, talking to my father. As I finished, I saw these two red objects in the window. A little confused, I asked him if there was anything outside that could reflect red like that. He said no. I laughed, saying, must be some critter then. That's when I saw what I now assumed to be red eyes, one last time in the Widowmaker tree from earlier. I didn't even realize I was staring for so long until my father interrupted me and said that my stepmom almost hit an animal and swerved off the road into a ditch. We needed to go pick her up. Now I've heard legends and myths, and I know the Mothman is considered a bad omen. So, a bit freaked out, I shut all the blinds and went to bed. But not before seeing that thing flapping its massive wings, before fading off into the sky. That was no bird, way too big, and the timing was too perfect. What was that? From J. Ion. I spent the first 6 years of my life in a neighborhood for working-class people that was made of very old apartment buildings in a small town in Malaysia. The buildings were constructed 50 years ago and were upgraded since, so the exterior of the buildings had a neglected look. Rusty metal installments, dented roofs, brown and black stains on the walls from years of exposure to rain and wind, peeling paint, and plants growing in the cracks and crevices. The worst part of it all, the inside of the buildings were infested with rats and cockroaches, and a myriad of other insects and critters that should belong in a sewer, not in the walls and ceilings of family homes with young, vulnerable children. To make things even worse, living in a tropical country, thunderstorms are regular occurrences, which affect the supply of electricity to homes, and sometimes entire provinces, due to lightning strikes and damage to old grid lines. Because of the lack of upkeep, coupled with the vermin infestation and bad weather, the power grid for my neighborhood gets cut off at least once a month, plunging every household into darkness at night and uncomfortable humidity and heat in the tropical climate. Whenever this happened, my family would leave their bedrooms and just sleep on the living room floor. It was the most aerated and cool area in the whole apartment, despite the lack of functioning fans and air conditioning. One such night was no different. My entire family was asleep in the living room because a particularly powerful thunderstorm was slamming down on the province. Coupled with extremely strong winds, it was as loud as police sirens blaring, just 20 meters in front of you. Yet my entire family was sound asleep. We were used to it. I remember it being past midnight when my eyes opened wide. I looked to my right at the entrance of the living room, which was a sliding glass door attached to a balcony. I remember hearing the loud wind howling and the door and windows vibrating in resistance against the wind's strength. But there was something else at the door. It moved in tandem with the intensity and frequency of the wind, pushing against the glass door when the wind picked up. And it was quiet. No sound came from it, other than the times it pushed itself against the glass, with the increasing and decreasing intensity of wind. I was horrified, but I stayed silent. I didn't want it to know that I was awake, that I was looking in its direction. I stared at it, trying to break into my home for about 3 minutes. The whole time I was imagining what death by this creature would be like. This creature definitely was no living being, or didn't resemble any. The creature had a head that looked like it was decomposing, with flaking gray skin, pink purple-brown patches with little gray and white hairs around the mostly bald top, and a lumpy face that looked bruised and gangrenous at the same time. But the worst part was the body, or lack thereof. Where the torso and limbs should have been was instead a dangling bunch of equally decomposed lumps, with the same colors as the skin on the creature's head. What I supposed are its entrails had less mobility than the head, but the entrails did slam very hard against the glass door when the creature rammed its head out of frustration and desperation after trying in vain to get into the living room for several minutes. Surprisingly, my family did not wake up, despite the loud sound the creature was making, trying to break the door. As the winds died down, it gave up slamming itself against the door. Instead, it stayed silent and still while looking into the living room. That's when I realized it was basically floating. There was nothing beneath the dangling lumps and nothing above its head. Somehow, I fell asleep after this realization, or maybe I fell unconscious from fright. In the morning, my parents woke me up for breakfast. I told them not to open the living room door in a panic, because there was a monster trying to get into the house. And that's when I turned my head and looked at the glass door in absolute horror, as it was already wide open. But the sun was up. It was a bright and beautiful morning, and I could hear birds chirping with a gentle breeze sweeping leaves away in the background. My parents smiled at me, said that it was just a bad dream, and that I have an overactive imagination. I didn't argue with them because I believed everything my parents said to me when I was little. Almost a decade later, after my family moved to a much better neighborhood, I was allowed to use a computer. I eventually found articles written about indigenous mythical creatures and folklore in Southeast Asia. Apparently, the creature I saw matched a Penangal, which means literally the remover in my native Malay language. It's a creature born out of a black magic practitioner who has to remove her head and organs from her body to go hunting for fresh blood at night. Before daybreak, the Penangal has to reattach its head and organs with its body, or it will perish from the slightest exposure to sunlight, as it is considered an affront to God due to its unnatural form, and to prevent damage to its organs. Based on what I've read on this creature, it's always female, and its long hair, glowing red eyes, fangs, and blood dripping from its dangling organs give it away. Yet the creature I saw trying to get into my family's living room did not match all of those features. Besides the floating head and entrails, it was different in the other aspects, such as the lack of discernible eyes or mouth, and the fact that the creature I saw looked more like a balding male, and its supposed organs looked like 5-year-old air-dried meat. So was the Penangal that tried to enter my home an exception to the rule for the Malay undead? Or was that an entirely different creature? Creepy folklore ghouls, unexpected intruders, and life and death struggles. Who knew just how terrifying it could be to live in a small town? But maybe they're small because everyone keeps getting killed or eaten. What a way to go. Good night. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you have a story of your own you want to hear on the show, share it with us at darkstories.org. If you want to support the show, check the links in the description. There's a link to donate on Patreon, a link to my merch store, and a link to start investing with Acorns, which helps me out a little bit too. Now, as usual, here are my 5 favorite early comments from the previous episode, titled 25 Real Ghost Stories. Leilani Tezga says, "Perfect for studying. Thank you." You're very welcome. Studying is a pain, so why not spice it up a bit? WarioWare Do-It-Yourself fan says, "My favorite game about ghosts is Luigi's Mansion. I'm more of a Dead Space hallucinating your dead girlfriend kind of guy." Luke Skywalker Indoor says, "I wish I could be a ghost and haunt my haters. You know, I think the Emperor did that, and he didn't have very good luck." The Kampshof says, "Right at the Geisterstunde," which means the ghost hour. Well, if you don't listen at the ghost hour, you're doing it all wrong. And Gina Wulika Pimpin' Your Crap says, "Hey, y'all. Have you heard of the long legs monsters? Yeah, I heard they're gonna be on the cover of Vogue, but their legs were too long." Well, that brings us to the end of this episode, but don't you worry, because more scary stories are on the way. Until next time, here are the credits to my amazing patrons who continue to donate. They're awesome people. Remember, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.